Greetings, salutations, and welcome to the Kreeger cast. I'm your host, Patrick Kreeger, and I'm joined, once again, by Darrell and Stephanie. Today's topic is going to be buttons. Sorry, Stephanie was looking at a ball of yarn. It was quite funny. Anyway.
I thought you were laughing at the buttons.
No. Anyway, so tonight we are going to be discussing the history of buttons, what buttons mean to us, our favorite stories involving buttons, our favorite buttons,
and buttons in general.
And General's buttons.
And General's buttons. Wow.
Good.
Yeah, thank you for setting that one up.
Applause.
Applause.
Put in the applause. Listener, I hope you're applauding.
Applauding.
Wow, we're throwing it out there.
We have a bit of homekeeping, groundkeeping, housekeeping to do.
Groundskeeping, landscape management.
Yeah.
We are going to be a bit of a Boothby here for a moment and say two things. One, I'm sorry, Internet, I was wrong. The cat documentary that I brought up during our Greece episode was not about Athens, but was about Constantinople, now Istanbul. And I'm basing that purely off of the fact that the Hagia Sophia is in the background, which clearly means
okay, so it's Istanbul.
Yeah.
Same climate, similar culture, similar cats.
Similar cats.
There are cats in Greece too, though.
So tonight we are drinking Rooibos tea.
Rooibos tea, yep.
What did you think of it, Stephanie?
I was trying to identify what it smelled like, and it smells like when you're dyeing, not dyeing, when you're dyeing wool with alum and indigo. So it's very off-putting for me. I don't know. I can't get behind it.
Okay.
I like it.
I think I would like it if it didn't evoke those memories, but
yeah, I think it's my non-tea tea. If I'm doing a non-Camellia sinensis tea, if I'm forced to, I'd take this over.
This?
Like,
well, that's.
Oh, don't get me started on the matcha. He's having another one of those matcha lattes, and it is probably cold by now, right?
Oh no, it's room temperature.
Great.
just the way he likes it.
Just the way.
Indeed. So, I'm going to ask a question that is mildly off topic. What's with the ball there?
Oh, this is the button box, which I will probably end up talking about later. But there just happened to be a musket ball in there. You know,
I was
like you do.
I was somehow hoping it was a musket ball button.
It was not. It is not a musket ball button.
So, you have this series of buttons in front of me. I'm seeing things that look like coins mounted on shanks. I'm seeing things that are flat against the table. I don't know how that's possible. This muffin-topped one here. Oh!
It has sunk between the ridges of the table.
Okay, I see that. As well as some plain buttons, some shiny buttons, some rusty buttons.
Some Kreeger buttons.
Some Kreeger buttons. I think... Oh, nope, that's the new Kreeger button. You do still have one of the old Kreeger Washington buttons,
yes.
though, right? Good. So, well, where do you want to start?
Well, let's start with... Where do we first encounter buttons? I mean, buttons are with us every day. Buttons are everywhere. But I think the where I first encountered buttons, two places. One is Civil War reenacting, and two is antiquing. We've talked about both of those things. And it's always particularly interesting to me because they all tell a story. And some of them, go with the plain button, and we see those throughout history. But for a lot of them, particularly the military buttons, you see that they are for a particular regiment, and they are used as an identifier for a particular regiment. So, for instance, this is the King's Eighth. That's a Revolutionary War era button that has a K and an 8, and that is, what everyone in the regiment wears. And you see those 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries where there's individual buttons for the regiment.
I now really see it because I really did wonder why the K was on its side next to two O's.
Yes.
But it
Is
clearly...
an 8.
It clearly isn't KS over an 8.
Yeah. And then, here's some of my original ones. These were dug from the Crimea. And these are all buttons that have individual Russian regiment numbers on them. So you can see, whether it was for identification from afar or from identification of, that these are our buttons that we're handing out to our men for, logistics purposes. There's a lot of individual regimental personalization. And then eventually we kind of go for more branch, where we see all of the infantry wear the same button, all the cavalry wear the same button, all the dragoons wear the same button, engineers, and we get away from the individual regiments.
I would like you to confirm or deny, or disprove, I guess would be the way to say it, confirm or disprove, a rumor I've heard about regimental buttons, which is that they were often used, and one of the reasons why they were made out of longer lasting materials like bronzes and brasses, is to identify where a regiment fought and died.
I hadn't heard that as much.
Okay.
I think it's probably more about, the regimental ethos, the regimental, the camaraderie among soldiers and having that same button. It's a little bit of the personalization and some of the choices they get to make. And from a supplies perspective, keeping track of your stuff.
Yeah.
I don't think that's the morbid route. It's probably a consequence, but I don't think that's the design for that in particular. But it is very convenient for historians after the fact to be able to tell where certain regiments fought and died.
Yeah.
And camped. I think people lose a lot of buttons in camp too, because this in particular, this is this is the regiment that I portray when we do Victorian, and that's a British Army 44th Regiment button from the Crimea, and that was dug from their campsite in Balaclava. And those, when we're in the Revolutionary War era, it's usually a solid, pewter or lead. Once we're all the way into the 1850s, it is a two-piece button where there's a shank and the button on the front, and that one's soldered here to the front of it. This one probably would have been lead covered in tin.
Just to describe the button here real quickly, it's a button about the size of a U.S. nickel, with a complex stamping of the maker on the back, and on the front has the 44 with the crown on top of it. It's actually really a quite handsome little button.
Yeah, and so that one was dug from the campsite, so we know that's where the 44th camped in Crimea. Cool. Yeah, some guy's farm now.
As a lot of places are. I just want to quickly describe a couple of the other buttons here. One of the things I find interesting about your Russian button here with the large number 7 on it is that it has a dot signifying that it's not an L, that it's a 7.
Yeah.
Which makes me wonder if they did have letters as well, or did they only have numbers?
No, this one is a 6 and it has a dot too.
Well, the 6 makes sense because it could be a 9, but
I think that's just standard there.
All those Cyrillic numbers. Is that a thing?
No.
Okay. That was just a question. Sorry.
Well, not for this in particular. But and then on the 7, you can see it has a very intricate back. You know,
Yeah.
whether it's the maker, and we'll get to that when we talk about yours, how we did your backs. But just to kind of give you one of my interesting button stories is, I've always been interested in buttons, and there's two ways that I kind of, you know, adopted the button as my spirit animal, as it were. One, I have this button box, and in reenacting, just as in the Civil War, people lose buttons, their buttons pop off, they fall off, whatever. And I've always had this button box available to all my friends, you know, for if you're losing a button, you need a button, take a button, leave a button. And people would often come rifling through here, especially right before going out on the field. You know, hey, I need a button, and then put on a button. And we morbidly called this the Appomattox the Appomattox Treasury, or the Appomattox no, the Andersonville. This was the Andersonville Bank. That's what it was, because in the you know, referencing the fact that a lot of prisoners used buttons as currency.
Yeah, and a lot of buttons do have tangible value.
Yeah. I mean, especially when you get into a lot of the officers' buttons, which are usually gold-plated or gold.
Were there ever silver buttons?
Yeah, and there are the silver buttons too. Particularly in the like these style that are pewter, there are solid silver versions.
Yeah. So these Revolutionary War buttons, right?
Those are cast.
Yeah, they're clearly cast as one piece.
And there are ones that are cast all the way into the Civil War era. This one is actually a cast version, and those were made in France for both sides. They were called the French import button, and they were imported both Union and Confederate. Soldiers had those kind of things. So back to my button stories for my button spirit animal, for lack of a better term, is throughout college or after college, some of my friends, you know, were asking, what am I doing? And you know, I'm a historical advisor, and I would talk about, you know, what I'm doing, you know, complaining about details and helping people to figure out uniforms and setting up the set, stuff of that nature. And so they would in jest make fun of me, saying, you're just complaining about buttons. And so, you know, I'm the button guy, and they'd kind of get on the buttons because I'd mention buttons every once in a while. So I kind of adopted that, and I always wear a historical button as a lapel pin.
Yeah, through your spare buttonhole in the collar.
through the buttonhole. Yeah. And, you know, whether I have an original, you know, right now I have a general's button from the Crimean War, but oftentimes I'll wear, like, the 44th, the new one we made.
Oh, wait, you have new 44th buttons?
Yeah, so this one, the tin one that you saw is the Crimean War, and then right towards the end of the Crimean War, we see an actual switch to a three-piece brass button like you saw in the Civil War, and with the uniform change that came in 1856 came the new buttons.
This is one you had made.
Yeah. Okay. So, you know, my company does a lot of historical reproductions. Most of the time it's out of necessity. You know, we need this particular buttons. Thing. Yeah. And the first one we did was actually, no one had reproduced, for reenacting purposes, the Florida button. Like any sort of Florida regimental button for the Confederate side. And so we started with this one, which has a 6-pointed star, which we always get asked if it's like some sort of, you know, Jewish battalion, but it's the Cherokee Rose, which was a symbol of Florida long before the war. And we reproduced those. And then there was this one, which is a Florida Eagle, and those are all available on lordrivers.com. But that's the Florida Eagle. Both of those were Civil War era Florida buttons, and the reenacting unit that I'm often with is Florida, and they were looking for something like that, and a lot of the Florida units around the country were also interested. And then when we started doing the 44th, we ended up commissioning the 44th button, and we do a post-Crimea impression, kind of like the Civil War era. If they were going to come visit the United States, this is what they would have worn. Indian Mutiny, 1860 kind of impression. But we commissioned the 44th buttons. We made those, and then the funniest one is actually for the 5 or 6 Spanish American War reenactors that are out there. We made the Spain infantry button from the era, which was the pattern 1876 Spain button. And you can see that one here. Made it the same as the originals with a steel on the back and brass on the front. And it has the Spanish crest with Infanteria on the bottom. So that was filling various holes in button needs around the world.
Buttonholes?
Buttonholes, as it were.
Sorry.
Wow. So, that's kind of the story of my buttonness.
You just had to button them up.
I had to button that up. Wow. Okay.
Sorry.
And you always wear originals.
Yeah, that is the other funny thing is I always try to wear on my uniforms when I'm doing living history. I'll try to wear one original button.
Yeah.
With the regulars. Like on my Union uniform, I have an original eagle that was new old stock. I think it was the same year that you got your CSA button.
Possibly. But we'll talk about that.
Yeah, it was new old stock, so it was from the period, but it was never issued. And I always wear that up at the top. And then on my Confederate uniform, I have an original British button because that's my impression. Doing the British mercenaries that fought for the Confederacy. So that's buttons. That's all buttoned up.
Oh,
as it were.
Well, this button here is shiny but drab.
Shiny but drab. Explain.
It just looks like frankly, it looks like a Spartan's shield.
Yeah, this one's it's a plain button. This one is actually for my 1890s Prussian uniform, the Dunkelblau.
Why would Prussians have plain buttons?
I know, but based off the originals that we were looking at for the regiment we're portraying, which is lazily the 44th, but they're an Ostprussian unit that it was convenient. 44, so we'll be the 44th wherever we go. But for 1890s Prussia, which is for a class we're doing soon, it was just a plain brass button.
Can I draw some baseless conjecture?
Sure.
That button looks easier to polish, looks shinier. I bet you it looks better on a uniform.
Yeah, from far away, I bet it looks pretty good.
Oh.
And that is one of the interesting things about button theory, as it were, with the Civil War in particular, is you have these people that are trying to dull their buttons, try to shine their buttons, and there are a lot of accounts, even in the later period in the Civil War, where regiments will have a shining day. That will have a kit day, where they do reference shining their buttons. And of course, in some of the earlier battles, I think it's a Bull Run, there's this account of a soldier noting how, as the Confederates stepped out of the trees, they looked over at all these grays, and they noticed the shine of their buttons, and the shine of their bayonets.
Oh.
And that's kind of attacking the myth of the ragged Confederate, but it's an ongoing thing about whether your buttons should be dull or not. And then, of course, once you get to like the Boer War era, there are people that are actively trying to dull their buttons because with the advent of more accurate rifles, you are, again, just like the Patriot, you're targeting the officers, so you can tell. But you don't actually like shiny buttons, do you?
So my problem, as you look at my shiny or dulled buttons, my problem is not the shine.
They're artificially dulled?
They're artificially dulled.
Okay.
My problem is not the shine of the buttons. In fact, I prefer a shiny button.
Okay.
But longevity.
Okay.
If you put a proper oxide layer on a piece of bronze, which my buttons are bronze, a proper oxide layer is nearly impervious to everything. Acids,
Wow.
a chemical attack, whatever. I don't mean that chemical attack like sarin gas, but,
they're going to get gassed.
And so, I boil my buttons, in water, which has the tendency of creating almost a blue on them.
Wow.
So these won't fingerprint. They, you can just toy with them. They won't get an uneven finish to them. And that's why I do it. I would prefer them to be shiny. But the other reason I found is that I use my buttons as a business card.
Yeah.
And the dulled button is easier to read.
Wow.
For older people.
And just for the dear listener, just like we had, my company had all these different historical buttons made, we actually ended up doing two different custom buttons for
3.
Yes, that was, well, there was the prototype and then...
Oh, 2 current runs.
Yeah, and then the two current ones for Kreeger Spirits. And it has Kreeger Washington on the first one.
On the prototypes.
Yeah, and then there are Kreeger Spirits now. And there were two materials. And why did you go with... There's usually we see regular brass, but you went with a bronze.
Yeah, so brass is a mixture of copper and zinc,
okay.
Whereas most bronzes are a mixture of copper and tin. And with brass, you can get what they call dezinkification.
Okay.
Which, what keeps brass shiny, what makes brass last long, is that the zinc is working as a sacrificial component. And so if you were to, say, bury a piece of brass or drop a piece of brass in water or whatever, the zinc slowly oxides out and wears away. And the zinc can be almost as much as 30% of the material. And so you end up losing all this, and little bits of the copper will float away at the same time. What this means is that your typical brasses in a harsh environment don't last more than 200 years. Normally a lot less. Like if you were to drop a piece of brass right on the shore of an ocean, you'd be lucky if that was there 25 years from now.
And you want yours to be found 500 years from now.
Yes. And so I wanted to do a true bronze, because a true bronze doesn't have that same issue. Tin, instead of oxiding and wearing away, like the zinc, it's not sacrificial. The tin oxides into a protectorant. And so a bronze button, if you were to put it in that same seashore environment, could last 1,000 years.
Wow.
And in a terrible environment such as being buried or in the ocean, can last 2,000 to 3,000 years.
Wow.
So a bronze button has a lot more life than a brass button. That's why I wanted that. But the original buttons said Kreeger Washington, because I thought that was most symbolic.
Yeah.
It's kind of like how the regimental buttons and the other buttons said where they were from.
Yeah.
But,
And then describe what we did to the back.
So on the back of the buttons, each button has my initials on it because I'm egotistical. And, I wanted it to say Patrick on it, but that was just impossible on the back of a button, so it has my initials. And then it has the date of manufacture, which is really cool, and they'll change throughout time. But since I do use these as my business card, that has to be something that people can search. And when you type in Kreeger, Washington, you get the Kreeger Museum in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
So putting Kreeger spirits on them makes it a lot easier. You actually find me.
And have people commented on, like, how unique that is as a business card?
Yeah.
Like, how do those go over?
So, normally when I ask people, do you want a button? They go, what?
Yeah.
And then they expect me to pull out like a campaign button,
Yeah.
That we use today. Then when I hand them one of these, their knee jerk is, that's incredibly cool.
Yeah.
I've gotten a couple responses of, I don't know what coat I would put this on. I've had a couple people say, oh, cool, I was missing a button on my jacket, I can put this on it. Which I think is funny.
Yeah.
When I really do just intend people to use them as a keychain or something like that. But my favorite reaction was, I was at a dinner, and this guy asked for my business card, and I said, I have the most unique business card you've ever seen. And he kind of rolled his eyes and was like, yeah, right. And I gave him a button, and he goes, okay, yeah, that actually is the most unique business card I've ever seen. They're just fun to play with. As you can probably hear in the background, we have been rattling them a little bit.
Lots of buttons.
So, yeah. And I'm going to go out on two limbs here. First limb, I still think you should put your website on the back of your buttons. But I
will be the second person to use buttons as a business card. And I don't know why I haven't done it before, but definitely going to do it now.
It's such a great way to let people know that your buttons are a replica, and to, when they're impressed with the quality, show up.
There's the first pattern one.
Yeah, the first pattern, we had two buttons made. We had a coat size button and a cuff size button. And they say Kreeger, Washington, and they have my original Raven on a barrel.
And annoyingly, the cuff size button was made even smaller than the standard cuff size button.
Yep. But you could still read Kreeger.
You could.
And still read Washington.
Yep.
I was really impressed with your ability to have that sort of detail on a button.
Yep.
But then I had, for reasons that cannot be discussed, I had to change my logo.
Mm-hmm.
And so now I have my bird.
Yes.
Bird.
It's a nondescript bird.
Nondescript bird on a barrel with the year my company will be founded, MMXX 2020. And I cannot tell you how pleased I am with these buttons, Darrell. It makes me feel very special to be able to give something to someone.
Yeah, they're
like
awesome. They leave an impression.
I actually even remember there's two incidences where I was giving someone a button, and someone else who was not part of the conversation came up to me and said,
just needed a button.
Can I have a button too?
And now, do you give out one or the other?
So, I am not going to lie, and dear listener, if you end up somehow running into me in real life, I'm sorry.
This is real life, Patrick.
I end up giving the brass buttons to, like, just generically, but then if someone actually, like, is important to me, I give them the bronze ones.
Oh, no. Do you offer them a choice sometimes?
Most of the time I give them the choice.
Okay.
And they always pick the bronze.
Really?
Except once. I had one guy pick a brass button once, and then I had another guy do it just because I said everyone always picks the bronze. Like, he picked the bronze, he had already had it in his hands, and then I said, yeah, funny, everyone always picks the bronze. And then he said, okay, I gotta pick a brass button.
What a hipster.
The brass buttons are significantly lighter. They're like half the weight of the bronze buttons.
Yeah.
So they don't feel as real, if that's the way to say that.
Yeah. It's not as bad as the my 44th one or the British General's button that I wear, where I'm pretty sure it's lead inside.
Yeah, where it has heft.
Yeah, they are quite hefty.
It's amazing what true works of art these older buttons are. Like, you get into Civil War era or earlier, and the stuff is almost like a piece of jewelry.
Yeah.
Which is just ridiculous.
And it is jewelry as when you get to the, at least the officers' buttons, which, if they're not thinly gilded, they are, pretty thickly gilded. There's lots of gold on the General's one that I have.
Are there solid gold buttons? I would imagine there have to be.
There are a couple that I know of that are solid. The solid ones I know are in the Revolutionary era.
Yeah.
When you do 18th century buttons. I know there are a couple that have solid gold, but they're not usually military.
Yeah.
I think even on some of the higher ranking ones, they're gilded brass.
That just makes the most sense. And you said you've seen silver ones before.
Yeah, I have seen solid silver ones.
But I just haven't had the fortune of seeing them before.
We can have them made up when you're feeling 18th century.
So now I'm going to test your knowledge just a little bit.
Okay.
The regimental number buttons come back in with the Germans during World War One.
Yeah.
The rumor I heard why they got rid of them, because they got rid of them at the end of World War One, was they didn't want the enemy knowing where specific units were based on their buttons. I think that's not a good argument.
Yeah, I think that we see in most armies a movement away from individualized things like that. We see, all the way in the 18th century, and you see it hugely at the end of the 19th century, where insignia, you can tell just from looking at someone's uniform what they do, how much money they make, where they come from, what they, what regiment they're in. Particularly, I'm thinking of how the Navy has the rating systems today, where you'll be an electrician's mate, and you can see what they do on their insignia. Well, the Army did it, and the British Army, the German Army, the U.S. Army would have similar system to that. Would have regiments on everything, from buttons to patches to hat brass. And I think, particularly after World War One, most of that is gone. A lot of the armies get rid of that before World War One.
Yeah.
But particularly at the end of the war, you see everything streamlined, everything interchangeable, and mostly insignia for branch.
So that was actually what I wanted to ask you about is, do you think that was, as the rumors say, to avoid the enemy knowing what units were in the area, or do you think that has more to do with mechanization and mass production?
I probably think it's something closer to production and logistics rather than
subfusing.
Yeah, and it's. I think that the people that defended them did, as I said before, see some sort of regimental ethos, regimental spirit in having those individualized buttons and insignia. But there are other ways of distinguishing that. A lot of them still have individualized patches and insignia on their headgear, but they might not need individualized buttons, which would be a nightmare for any sort of supply situation.
Yeah,
and especially another reason for that is most likely where you get away from the smaller areas or the region or town providing the necessities for that regiment. No longer are, after World War One, it's not Bavaria providing all these things. It's the German army as a whole.
Yeah.
You no longer have, after World War One, because there are vestiges in World War One, you no longer have New York sending troops. They're not going to be providing the New York buttons to go for all the New York troops. And so when you have, a streamlined uniform, streamlined needs, you're probably going to lose all that.
Which is unfortunate, but yeah.
Where does everything get produced? Like, is it produced more locally when you have, like, the 44th?
Yeah, a lot of them are produced locally, and you can see that on the back mostly. But, even when we get in the Civil War, you start to see they're produced at a particular depot or factory or company, contracted, but they're still being paid for, commissioned by those individual areas like New York.
Yeah, and I was actually thinking that too, like you were talking about logistics and stuff like that. I would kind of imagine back in ye olden days, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you would carry with you more or less the uniforms that you would wear on campaign, and were not likely to get new ones.
You're likely not to get more, and I've heard it time and again that the housewife, meaning the sewing kit, is, if not the most important uniform or important piece of kit after your weapon, it's up there. Especially with a lot of Civil War accounts where we see so many people needing to repair on the spot. I mean, even in reenacting, you see people needing to do repairs on the spot, and even in the modern military, you see a lot of relatively modern. You see housewife type situations being issued out and being used, especially in the field, and you need buttons like that, to be able to be issued to everyone. And so if you can't get your particular number of regiment, that's going to be a nightmare. But yeah, the housewife, super important. In fact, if there, I was reading an account like a week ago where this regiment was issued a small amount of uniforms. They couldn't go to everyone, so they cut them all up, and everyone put them in their housewives, so that when they would have holes or patches, they would end up using that. It's because they didn't want to have multiple types of coats in one unit, but so they use those to do repairs.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And yeah, you were talking about relatively recent military. I know that was a thing with the German army during World War II. As an officer, you just had a sheet of stuff that were the regulations, and you could take it to any clothing maker to have them make your uniform based off those regulations. Which is why you get so much variation in the German stuff. And I know a little bit of that transferred over to the Americans as well, not necessarily in terms of the clothing itself, but in terms of your accoutrements, your rank insignia for officers could be made by your local jeweler, as long as it met certain specifications. I know that that's a big thing with wings. Pilots' wings were often made by, like, your jeweler if you wanted it, actually in gold or in silver or whatever.
Yeah, and especially when, officers are, as they were historically, obliged to provide their own uniform.
Yeah.
And we were at the military show with our friend, and he wanted to buy some of these old World War II era silver captain bars.
Yeah.
Which were nicer than the ones that you could readily purchase today.
In fact, one of the pilot's wings that I have, I know the man who wore them, and he wore his pilot's wings through World War II, and then he got a rank increase that necessitated change to his wings. And so he just had his wings changed rather than buying new ones because they meant that much to him.
Wow.
Which I think is really cool to see a modification. I know that's a little off topic of buttons, but it's on the same path.
It's up there. So what do people do before buttons?
Yeah, Stephanie.
I've been sitting here knitting in the corner. Yeah, so we really don't get the button as we understand it today, right? Something that is attached to clothing and it goes through a buttonhole. We really don't get that until the late 12th, early 13th century, because that's when clothing starts to get fitted to the point where you need something that will hold tight clothing together without pulling apart, or damaging the clothing, which, you know, if anyone has ever tried to pin themselves into clothing, you know that pins can bend and the fabric tears a lot more easily that way. So before that, you know, with ancient clothing, we have brooches and pins and fibulae and different sort of methods to hold loose clothing together, but there really isn't any pressure on the fabric apart from just the fabric itself, right? There's no holding a body into something. And in the early 13th century, we start to get a little more shape to clothing, and we start to get buttons. Buttons, as we understand them in the Middle Ages, really start out as just little balls of fabric. You have a circle of fabric and you gather it into a ball, and then you go around the outside and do it again. So it's this tight little wad of fabric that is just a circular ball. And that will go through a buttonhole. And then obviously we start to get, as we get into the 14th century, there are just buttons everywhere on fashionable clothing. You might have a line of 100 plus buttons down the front of a surcoat all right next to each other. Or, you know, same thing, dozens along the side of a sleeve, because things are very, very fitted, to the point that you have the same body support as you would have with what would come later in a corset.
Really?
So, yeah. So you need, obviously, a lot of support for that. But as they start to become like an ostentation, fashionable thing, you actually have something that's very characteristic to the Middle Ages, which is, instead of having, like we would have today, buttons on one side and buttonholes on the other, you have the full buttonhole on both sides, and then you have a strip of ribbon or fabric or something, and then all the buttons sewn onto that, and then you put the ribbon behind both pieces of fabric, and then you put them through both sets of buttonholes, and then you just kind of whip stitch the button or the piece of fabric onto the very back of it, so that you can really quickly change out sets of buttons, because again, if you're using it as ostentatious consumption, you want to be able to purchase one set of buttons and use it for different garments.
Okay. So wouldn't be,
or if you're super rich, I guess if you have multiple sets of buttons and put them in the same garment. But yeah,
that's what I was wondering, is was it always one way? But I guess it could be both ways.
Yeah, you could do it one way or the other. I have two of them that I use for 14th century, and I have two strips, and I change them out of the same gown. I change them out of the same two gowns. So
are they original buttons?
Go either way. No, they're cast off original buttons, so they're pewter cast. Yeah. Cool. Yeah. But sort of as we get a little later into the century, buttonholes are very time consuming to sew.
They look awful to do.
Yeah, I would never. People who do them on the machine are braver than I am. But
you do it by hand?
Yeah. It makes me nervous to do them on the machine.
Seriously.
But it is a lot quicker to do them on the machine. Yeah, but they're very time consuming, and obviously, as Darrell was talking about, with a lot of wear and tear on the buttons themselves, buttons tear out. The buttons themselves can break, depending on what material they're made out of. And So as we kind of progress throughout history, a lot of what you'll find in the 18th and 19th century is people either having false buttons on the front and just pinning their clothing, or having false buttons on the front and using hooks and eyes, which are both a lot... They take a lot less time to sew on.
Yeah.
And they're a lot sturdier, and they're much more easily replaced. If something should wear or should break, they're much easier to replace than
they're much easier
button. Right, especially when you're looking at 18th century death's head buttons and stuff like that are really intricately made. They're out of wooden discs covered in all different designs of thread, embroidered buttons. All those, the wear and tear on them is a lot more than you would want out of thin silks and stuff like that. So a lot of times you just put them on the front. In the 18th century, coats don't even close. Generally, they're left open. They have decorative buttons on there, but they're not really closed. But yeah.
And we didn't talk about a lot of civilian, because I know we got wrapped up in the military, but there's a lot of different materials that civilian buttons go through. We go from the cloth buttons, wooden buttons, to the metal, and we see glass and porcelain. We see Bakelite, and we even see I have a collection of original ones of Goodyear buttons that are rubberized buttons starting in the 1850s. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot of instances where the glass buttons become accidentally broken. Oh, yeah.
Well, I mean, a lot of undergarments in the first place have either, in the 17th, 18th century, they're actually made out of linen themselves. You take linen and you wrap it around sort of like a little wooden awl, and then you whip stitch around it. So it's like a nice little linen disc almost, and then you stitch up the middle of it so it becomes like a little linen button. Yeah. So that when you're wringing that out, you're putting it through the arduous process that is pre-washing machine laundry, that it survives that process. When you get a little bit later into the 19th and 20th century, it's a very, very thin wood or rubber or some other material that's covered with the fabric of whatever the undergarment is. So that those can go through things like mangles and ringers, which are just the two large rubber like rolling pins almost that you crank, and you put the clothing through it and it wrings out all the water.
My grandfather got his hand stuck in a mangle.
Yeah.
His hand was mangled.
Yes. Oh. Yeah. It was a lot.
Did your grandfather have one too?
My dad.
Oh, your dad did?
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. A lot of kids with their fingers stuck.
And mangled.
Yes, and mangled.
Is that really where that comes from?
I think so.
That doesn't seem like a factoid.
Yeah.
A lot of things are like bad history, but that one seems to make sense.
I was just wondering if it was the other way around too.
No, because they're sold as mangles. The difference between a ringer and a mangle is that a mangle is supposed to actually give the fabric like this shine as it goes through, but that's apart from the topic. But yeah, I mean, we have lots of different. There's a great episode of Call the Midwife where she's, one of the nurses is handing down her baby clothes, her old baby clothes, to one of the other girls who's just had a baby. She's like, oh yeah, my mother made these, and the buttons on them are actually from her wedding dress. She took the mother of pearl buttons off her wedding dress and put them on the baby clothes, and she's saying this right as her friend is putting these clothes through the mangle, and you can just hear them crunching. And you see that they've all been broken, but it's interesting even just from a fashion perspective. Like, for example, during the Regency, men's coats, typically we see, obviously we have cloth covered buttons, but just different fashion things. Like generally in the Regency, when you have a man's coat, if it's blue, there will oftentimes be gold colored buttons. And any other coat, it's usually just fabric covered. I don't know what the reason for that is. It must have been, maybe it was someone prominent wore it that way, but...
Dumb question.
Yes.
What's the Regency?
The Regency is like Jane Austen's period, the early late 18th, early 19th century.
It's when King George was rather mad, and the Prince Regent was made regent of England, of Britain. The fashion term is a little more broad than the actual Regency itself. We use the term Regency to refer to about 1795 to like 1820. The actual Regency was what, 10 to 20? Right around there.
Yeah.
We'd probably call it Napoleonic.
Yeah. Or Empire, depending on where you're from. Yeah.
I just hadn't heard that phrase before, so thank you.
Yeah.
So, are we now going to tell the stories of our favorite buttons?
Okay, let's go.
Yeah.
What's your favorite button?
Well, beyond my own button. Like my favorite individual
You
button.
have to like your own button.
Yeah. If I have to pick a style of button, it's my own button. But in terms of an individual individual button, it would be my CSA button, my Confederate States of America button, because it just has a really cool history. Apparently around 1867, 1868, the rumor goes that some guy died who used to own a general store. And since there was a dispute over who would get to own the general store and its contents, they just kind of boarded it up and people forgot about it. And what I was kind of, led to believe and all that is that rounds about 2008 or so, someone opened up this general store and started selling off the contents at auction because they needed to, use the building or whatever. And so I met an antique dealer at Civil War days who had bought a card of Confederate buttons. He had both the jacket buttons as well as the sleeve buttons. And so there was like a cardboard card of never issued CSA buttons.
Yeah.
And so I bought one of these jacket buttons, which is about 1 inch across, and it's still, 150 years or so later, has a mirror shine on it.
Yeah.
Which is just insane.
That's how my federal button is.
Yeah. I mean, it's ridiculous. The only thing is that somewhere in its history, a little drop of something dropped on it, and so there's this little pool of patina just in this one area of the button. And so as an individual button, that's my favorite. What about for you?
Well, I'm on the Kreeger cast, so my favorite button is the Kreeger button.
Well, thank you.
I think I'm always going to have a place in my heart for the first one that we made, the Florida button with the Cherokee Rose. Of course, I love my Crimean War buttons. All the originals from the 44 that's dug, to the British General's button I wear, or the Adjutant General's button I wear, the gilded ones that are super heavy. But the one button that I didn't bring today because it's very fragile, and every time I move it, a little bit of another piece chips off. So I kind of it needs to be in stasis and never move again.
That makes sense.
Is I have an original Napoleonic button, an Imperial Guard button that was dug in Russia.
Mm.
So that one didn't come home.
No.
And that one is probably my favorite button because it has the most of a story to it, and people really like seeing that in person, to see something from Napoleon's army.
And I think that's what we were hitting on earlier, is that one of the things that's so special about buttons, from a collector's perspective, is the story they tell without needing to explain anything.
Yeah.
You can just have a button sitting on a shelf and it's clearly, Spanish, or it's clearly American, it's clearly French, based on the designs on them.
It's clearly Kreeger.
It's clearly Kreeger. Just based on its design and the way it is. And then when you start explaining it, it gets more special. But the fact that it can tell a story without you there is just really awesome. So, do you have a favorite button?
I do have a favorite button. I have a set. I was reproducing this black 1850s paletot jacket from, I want to say it was the Met. It could have been the Kyoto Costume Institute. Anyways, and so I was looking online for the buttons for it, and I found these perfect, and it's interesting because morning wear in general, like clothing that people would wear for morning, the buttons at least often don't survive to us in that fabulous of condition because that they're not meant to be shiny. Yeah. They're meant to be very sort of drab and not sort of draw attention, just like the rest of the fabric and everything is. But because they're just buttons, they get, passed on and they get reused and, put on everything that everyone ever is sad about. Just survival bias. We don't often get them in really great shape. But I found this fantastic entire set of 8 jade morning buttons, and they're all in perfect condition. And so I have those on my 1850s black jacket, and I love them a lot.
And I just want to make it clear to our dear listeners, that's mourning as in the act of grieving,
yes,
not in the time
not
of day.
The time of day.
Just needed to specify that.
Yes.
So, I actually have a few additional button stories. They're not my favorite buttons, but they're interesting button stories. I think the first antique I ever bought was a button. When I was very small, small enough to where I don't remember how old I was on a trip with my parents, and we went somewhere, and there was this antique curio cabinet, and it said, anything in this cabinet, $2. And I distinctly remembered that sign that said anything in the shelf, it said shelf, was $2, and I had $2, so I wanted to pick something from that shelf. And it was mostly stupid stuff like, nails.
Okay.
And rusty belt buckles, that had no design or anything on them. Flotsam that they had found by this train station. But there was a button, and now that we're talking about buttons the way we are, I bet you it was one of those steel back buttons. Because only the dome of the button was preserved. And it wasn't preserved that well. It was a brass button, and it had decayed along the edge, which, if it were steel, and it were brass, in the ground with water, would cause a chemical reaction between the steel and the brass, which would cause the brass to eat away where it touched the steel. So that makes so much sense. But it's this massive Santa Fe cross that has the cross of the Santa Fe Railroad, and it says Santa Fe across it. And my favorite train as a kid, and to this day, is the Santa Fe, the Zephyr, the red and silver one. And so I bought that button, or that remnants of the button. I think that was actually my first antique.
Nice.
I also think that might be why I have such this thing about longevity. Because this random piece of flotsam that some guy lost off his coat, frankly, not that long ago. The Santa Fe button could not have been but from the 30s.
Okay. But it still told a story.
It still told a story by its existence. And it was still there even though everything else around it had rotted away. I thought that was pretty cool.
That is pretty cool.
Do you have any other button stories?
Oh, just that, as a joke, some of my college friends will send me bags of 500 buttons.
Okay.
To commemorate various things. One time I got, the contract for one of my HBO things, and sure enough, 1,000 plastic buttons showed up. Amazon next day.
That's actually kind of cool. And you do see...
I've embraced it. It's my spirit animal.
You do see often in antique stores, there's... you'll see jars upon jars upon jars of buttons.
I have a friend that's afraid. He's legitimately gets freaked out when he hears a jar of buttons rattling.
Huh.
Like he gets very angry. Like that's what a very like
Specific thing.
specific and odd fear.
So I have 2 more button stories.
Are you the guy with the button fear?
No. Actually, one of my favorite encounters with giving the button as a business card was I was giving a button to a man who, the reason I gave it to him was he had this wall of jars of buttons. And so I gave him a button because I'm like, hey, you collect buttons, here, have my button. And he goes, oh, I just like jars of buttons. This is something special. I'll keep it separate. And I just thought that was really cool. But 2 buttons that I got that I particularly like, this where I found them, was I was in a small antique shop in Germany, and I asked that guy for, like, did he have any World War II stuff, because I collect World War II stuff. And he says, that's not the sort of stuff we like to keep around. Most of my stuff is older, but since you asked, here. And he had a little jar, no, not jar, but, bowl of new old stock Kriegsmarine buttons from 1944.
Wow.
So I picked up one of those coat buttons, and it just, there's nothing really special about it. It's just an anchor, as most Navy buttons are.
Someone actually gave me, I think this is, I'm derailing your story.
It's fine.
But someone had given me like a box of little Civil War knickknacks when I was very small. Had to been like 7 or 8.
Mm-hmm.
And I went and found it again. Just a few things floating around, and they were like, a button, or it was a bullet, little things, and some of them were repro.
Mm-hmm.
There was an original Confederate Navy button in there.
Oh, that's
so
cool.
And I didn't know I had it until this year, which was crazy.
Wow.
So found that. The things you find in your drawer.
So is that like your earliest collecting memory, or?
Oh no, that particular box of things was like got shoved in a drawer. Like, I don't know why I didn't find it interesting at the time.
Oh.
No, we've talked about some of my earliest collecting stuff, because I think our theory was, do we like it because that was the only thing that was available to us as kids? Whether it was, do we actually like collecting silver, or is that what we can afford? But no, it was completely nondescript in my collection of things, and sure enough, it was Confederate Navy. But yeah, you had Kriegsmarine buttons.
Oh yeah, so I pulled out this button, and it was stamped 1944 on the back, and it to this day is the best looking button I've ever seen, because it has the 2 things going for it of being a Navy button, so it has to be a fairly decent quality to be Navy.
Yeah.
And in terms of material, so it doesn't rust or anything like that. And then having going for it that it's the most recent button where people still kind of cared about the quality of things. So, like, they had the ability of making something hyper accurate. Like, this is like almost like watch caliber nice.
Oh, the engraving?
Yeah, the detail on it is just absurd, particularly on the back, and the way the whole button fits together. It's a 3-piece button, as you said, you were talking about, with the shank, the back, and the cap, I guess. And all of that is just perfect, which is just funny. But then he said, "Oh, you like buttons? I have something for you." And so he pulled out a button that I don't know how old it is. He claimed that he said it's as old as the year on it. I don't know if that's true, but it's made out of about a $50 sized silver coin from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it has a shank welded onto the back to it, or I guess soldered onto the back of it. And the reason he wanted me to have this particular button is that the coin was from 1776. And he's like, it was made the year your country was founded.
Huh.
So he
That's
gave
cool.
he gave me a really good deal on that button. I think he ended.
And so it's Austrian.
Yeah.
Huh.
He claimed, and I don't think there's any credence to this, he claimed that it was off of an Austro-Hungarian military jacket.
Huh.
Because he had a whole bunch of them that had been taken off of something. Just that this particular one was from 1776. There was like a 1778, 1767. Those are the only other years I can remember off the top of my head.
And remember, it's just Austrian if it's before 1867.
Oh.
Yep. There's no Austria-Hungary until 1867.
Well, sorry.
You're so stuck in World War One, whereas, I'm before that.
Yeah, my head
from a different time.
My headspace is like 1910 through 1950.
That's the now for you.
Yeah.
Now for me is like 1850, 1860. When's now for you, madam?
1900 to 1910.
Oh, fine.
So
it's not even that's my favorite. That just feels
that's
like the
just
present.
what now is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So those were my two button stories that happened to be the same story.
And I'm sure we'll talk about this in the coin episode, but the Austrians are ones for putting. You said it was made out of a coin.
Yeah.
And they are ones for keeping the same year, are they not? Especially with those Maria Theresas.
Oh, that's post. That's later.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's later.
Okay.
That's called oh gosh, it's like memorial coin where you
where you keep the same year, even though you print a new. You're casting them every year.
Yeah. That's one of the conspiracy theories on Swiss gold. The Swiss stamped coins in 1945 out of gold that were dated, I want to say 1935 or 1938. And so people say, this is, they're covering up Nazi gold. No, it was that the Swiss weren't doing it as a coin. So coins
they were doing it as bullion.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's why they're even dated like 1935 L for lingot. I might be mispronouncing that, but that's the way the word looks. I
think lingot is the those little things that you earn in Duolingo.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, it's either... I'm going to assume it's not Italian.
Okay.
Because otherwise you would have perked up at that.
I would have.
So it's either French or German for bullion.
It's la ingot.
Yeah.
Like the ingot.
Mm.
Nice.
So anyway, my that's all off topic, and we'll have a whole coin episode. But yeah, this was a circulating coin of some sort.
Okay.
Anyway.
Any other button stories?
Well, I could talk about my most meaningful button in terms of like.
Yes.
Definitely.
I mean, lame. But the original Union button you gave me.
Which one was that?
You gave me an eagle button.
An original one?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm awesome.
Yes. Apparently some guy had come up to you and given you two original buttons. And so you kept one and gave me one. And you even kind of made a passing smirk about, I kept the better one.
Oh, okay.
And I like...
I was smart. I remember
Smart
that.
and nice.
Yeah, I was going to say, but you
now.
didn't have to give it to me, period.
I remember that now.
Yeah.
And then the other button associated with one of our first endeavors is the engineer button.
Yeah.
And that's one of the most interesting buttons because it's one of the buttons that is still used as a separate button in the Army.
Oh, they still have an engineer button?
Yeah, there's, as far as I know, it was on my grandfather's uniform in
Recently.
the 60s.
Yeah.
And it was, they still make them today. But the Essayons, Let Us Try in French, is being held by an eagle over a castle wall. and that's the engineer button. And we did our Union engineer impression, but different buttons. In fact, my grandfather used to talk about how his friends in other branches of the army would call him Funny Buttons because he was in.
That's kind of cool.
The engineers. Always buttons. The
Yeah.
buttons follow me wherever I go.
Well, buttons are cool.
Yeah.
They're just like we've said all along. They're another way to tell a story. Well, Stephanie, unless you have anything else to add.
I think I'm good.
Want to button it all up?
Yeah. And it's funny because even this podcast will end with the pressing of a button. Yeah.
Interesting.
So, until next time, dear listener, see you out there.